So I decided to start off 2014 and the reboot of the Speakin' Beacons vlog with a skill that's really fundamental. It's something that could be useful in all formats of debate, in all limited prep events, definitely in your platforms, and even quite possibly if you're putting together a character for an original interpretation. What I want to talk about is how you can use language to convey that you are communicating powerfully. And this comes out of the work of, well, he's actually a professor of linguistics. His name is George Lakoff. He's written a good deal about metaphor. You may be familiar with a book entitled Metaphors We Live By, and there's another book, more recent, entitled Don't Think of an Elephant. But all the way back in 1973, he pioneered the study of powerful language use, and in the communication field, there have been a number of studies done that have confirmed and extended his findings. And so what I want to do is I want to talk through the principles that came out of his work about how you, with your choice of words and with your language behaviors, can convey to an audience, and especially to judges, that you are communicating powerfully, and then talk a little bit about the features of the context, because it's not always in your interest to maximize your power and to come across really powerful. You want to have a little bit of finesse based on what happens to be going on in your competitive situation in any given round. So the first principle he found was that people who use a lot of intensifiers, using intensifiers makes you seem less powerful. Now, intensifiers are words like very, extremely, absolutely, totally, really. And it feels like what you're trying to do is you're trying to pump up your utterance. You're trying to enlarge your claim by tacking those words onto it. In a similar finding that's so similar, I'm going to talk about the two together, he also found that people who use empty adjectives, was his word for them, wonderfully, incredibly, amazingly, it's as though they subconsciously, almost subliminally, feel as though their substance, their content is not convincing on its own, and their own credibility is not enough on its own, so they beg the listeners to believe them with these inflating words, with the intensifiers and with the empty adjectives. So be clear, I'm not saying you should use those words. I'm saying in situations where you want to communicate powerfully, you should leave those words out. You should be a lot more concise. You should simply say what you have to say and not add in words that underline your claim. Now, what he found that goes in the other direction a little bit, he found that sometimes people communicate using what he called hedges. And hedges are things like maybe, probably, I suppose that, I guess that. And those actually back off a little bit from the claim that's being made. And some people find that confusing and say, well, if intensifiers make you seem less powerful, why would hedges also make you seem less powerful? The powerful way to speak is simply to say what you have to say, and to say it with confidence, and to say it in as many words as are necessary, but not more words than are necessary. So the fourth thing he found after intensifiers, empty adjectives, and hedges was he found that it takes away from your power as a communicator to use what are called tag questions. Some people end everything they say with a tag question. Tag questions take away your power, right? I try to avoid tag questions when I want to seem powerful, don't you? Those are examples. It's almost as though you are asking the audience for permission to make the claims that you want to make. So, if you found that that is something that you do, and I remember when I was in college I had a teammate who would end every single argument she made with right, and at one point she was even writing out answers to a disadvantage, and she stopped and smacked herself on the forehead because the coaches had told her not to do this, because she was writing right at the end of the different answers. Third, no perceptual link, right? This would be at the bottom of the agenda, right? And right was written down on the script of answers. Don't do that. Tag questions take away from the impression you can convey that you communicate powerfully. So you want to watch for those in situations where you're trying to maximize your power. A fifth pattern that he found was disclaimers. Disclaimers are, now I may be wrong about this. Now don't hold me to this. Now it's not always true, but it's sometimes true. And those, I think it seems pretty obvious why those would be language patterns that take away from your power, because much as the same with hedges, you're backing off. You are diluting the power of the claim that you make. And the last language behavior that he found, and subsequent research has shown really undercuts the perception that you speak powerfully, is giving in to interruptions or giving in to simultaneous speech. And that blurs and it gets right on the line between verbal behavior and nonverbal behavior. And I have another video that I'm going to make fairly soon about nonverbals that convey power, because they're related topics but they're not identical. But the idea that when someone attempts to interrupt you, you shouldn't back off. You should persevere in the face of being interrupted, and you should persevere in the face of simultaneous speech. Now, not to the point where you're shouting, not to the point where you come off as unpleasantly aggressive or unpleasantly loud and you make a bad impression. But you simply want to, it sometimes takes being very sharp with your timing to watch for them to pause and for you to continue to assert yourself and to continue to try to work over and continue despite the interruption. That's a behavior that Lakoff found was something that lets you convey a sense of power. Now, with that out there, the sort of guidelines for how you can communicate powerfully, then the question becomes, when is it that you want to convey that you're communicating powerfully? Well, at a baseline, it is good to err on the side of communicating powerfully. It's good to go into any speech situation, definitely for a platform or an impromptu, any limited prep, definitely for any of those. You don't want to go in domineering, like you're going to put the judge in her or his place. But you do want to go in very, very assertive, very, very positive. You can't wait to get this message out. You are certain that you've got it straight, and you are fully in control and commanding the room. That's true in any of the events where it's just you and the audience, just you and the judge. In debate, it's a little bit trickier. You've got to manage the impression you make, and who your opponent is makes a big difference. There are two factors in play: experience, perceived experience, and gender. Let's talk about experience first. If you are the less experienced, less celebrated, less successful debater, it is important that you go in and that you assert power. It's important that you check your behaviors and you go in very assertively. Because a debater who's been around, a debater who's established a reputation, very often will be able to project cues to the judge that they're the ones who are really supposed to win, that they're the ones who are better known, that they earned their reputation, that they simply have more confidence. And judges will respond, especially if they get at all confused on the substance, they will respond to that. And the debater who looks as though she or he believes that they are supposed to be the winning side, very often the judge may not be able to explain why, but the judge will find that debater's claims more compelling. Now, it's tricky though if you are the more experienced debater. If it's close, go in and use your power. But if it's not close, if it's someone who's really, really inexperienced, that's when it's important that you take some of these principles, intensifiers, empty adjectives, hedges, and tag questions, and disclaimers, and you think about those are ways that you can seem a little bit more approachable. If you want to avoid the impression that you are pushing this young, inexperienced debater around, if you know that you've got your story completely straight on the merits, that you know your arguments inside and out, and that you're not going to let the round get away from you, then that's possibly a time when you want to seem a little bit more approachable. You want to not distance yourself from your opponent quite so much in your power behaviors, because you want to seem likable to the judge. Because if the judge gets the impression that you're actually, well, there are some judges who will just have the underdog reaction set in. If there's really a huge gap in ability and power between yourself and your opponents, then the judge may start rooting for them to find something, just find something. And if they do find something, and it's something that in an ordinary debate would be an annoyance but nothing special, but the judge has started thinking of them as the underdog, that's when that becomes dangerous. But if you have outstripped your opponent, stayed way out in front of your opponent on the substance, but you've also not quite used so much of these sorts of power behaviors as to trigger that underdog response, very often not only do you keep little arguments from becoming danger, but it also means better speaker points. Way, way down at a foundational level, one of the best ways to win consistently is to try to engineer it to where the judge is secretly rooting for you to win. To where the judge, and especially a judge who's never seen you before in her or his life, really wants you to win. By virtue of having observed you, by virtue of the first impression you made, the judge really will feel happy at seeing that you succeed. And one of the ways to do that is to be sort of accommodating, sort of converging with your opponent who's not quite as experienced. Converging not in the sense of making mistakes or making strategically unwise moves, but pulling back some of those subtle cues of confidence and staying within range of them. Likability is actually a very powerful driver of credibility, and you don't want to be domineering. Now, that's more than I meant to say about that, but the second factor is even more powerful, and the second factor is when gender is in play. This is especially true if you have a judge who's dropped a few clues that she or he has very, very traditional views on particular social issues. If you have a judge who feels that way, then you should assume that traditional gender roles are going to be enforced. And in that case, it really is... It's something that you need to pay the most attention to if it is a cross-gender match. In a Lincoln-Douglas debate, if it's a woman against a man, or in a team policy debate, if there are women on one side and men on the other, as opposed to everybody being the same gender. If you have a cross-gender debate, then whoever is female is going to want to be excellent on the substance, know absolutely every fact, explain everything and be able to excel. But at the same time, seem cheerful, be very careful to seem to be enjoying yourself, positively frame things more than you negatively frame, talk about your arguments do accomplish things, and say that more, not exclusively, but more than making references to how your opponent's arguments do not do things, or are lacking things, or are failing to do things. When you make comparisons, make them positive comparisons to your benefits, and express your pleasure, your joy, your satisfaction, your happiness about those things. Now, if you have a judge who believes in traditional gender roles, and you are female and you come in and you use a lot of the power behaviors, what you're going to do at almost a subconscious level, or what you run the risk of doing, it won't happen in every case, but what you run the risk of doing if you use these power behaviors to excess is of seeming domineering, of just bringing about a certain visceral dislike. And that is the kind of thing, it'll show up in your speaker points and it'll show up in close debates. Now, if you're a guy and it's a cross-gender debate, what you want to be aware of is if you use some of these power behaviors too much, you're going to come across as rude. You're going to come across as not showing sufficient politeness, sufficient chivalry for your opponent. So, what both of you want to do, if it is the case that you want to adapt to the judge by putting on a display of those traditional gendered behaviors, what you need to do as a female debater is you need to do less engineering of the impression, do less coming in absolutely sure that you're winning, and instead a little bit more absolutely sure that you've done your homework and you know what you're talking about. And at the same time, being a little bit low-key, a little bit not under pressure, not intense, enjoying yourself. Now, if you are a male debater in that setting, it's still probably a good idea to convey a certain amount of firmness, to use a moderate portion of some of those powerful communication behaviors. But don't let it go as far as you would let it go if you were debating a rival in a high-pressure debate and you were into it and you were sinking your teeth into the debate a little bit. Just back it off a little bit. Dial it back a very little bit. Now, in a situation like that, if it's a woman with a female opponent or a guy with a male opponent, then I would say at that point go to town. It's just barely possible that if you are a woman with a female opponent and you engage in too many of the powerful behaviors that you still could trigger off a negative reaction of the kind that I described before. But, you know, with any judge, not just a judge who was expecting traditional gender roles to be acted out, but with any judge, if you go too far in trying to convey power and certitude, you can come across as domineering. So you want to lean in that direction, but you don't want to go overboard, which really is good advice when it comes to almost any element of delivery. So keep that in mind. In speaking situations, a little bit more power than is typical, well, actually a fair amount more power than is typical, is a good thing. And in debate, be a little bit careful based on who your opponent is, and in some cases, based on who your judge is. And if you do those things, what I think you'll find is debates that used to be close, or debates in which you used to get mediocre points, you'll see a difference. And definitely the people who are judging you and the people who are watching you to pick up the impression you're conveying, they will see a difference too.